Story 1. It was a calm, quiet summer night. I was scrolling through my phone, looking for something to do to pass the time. That's when I stumbled upon an ad for an escort service. I had always been curious about the world of escorting, but I had never actually gone through with it. I took a deep breath and decided to take the plunge. I called the number listed on the ad and was greeted by a woman with a seductive voice. She asked me what I was looking for, and I hesitated for a moment before telling her that I just wanted someone to keep me company for the night. She told me that she had the perfect girl for me and gave me the address of a nearby hotel. I got dressed and headed out into the storm, my heart racing with anticipation. When I arrived at the hotel, I was met by a tall, slender woman with long, black hair and piercing green eyes. She introduced herself as Leela and led me up to her room. As soon as we got inside, Leela started to undress. I couldn't help but feel a little nervous, but I also couldn't deny the attraction I felt towards her. She was incredibly beautiful and seemed to know exactly what she was doing. We spent the night talking and laughing, and before I knew it, the sun was starting to rise. I decided to call it a night and started to get dressed. Leela watched me with a sly smile on her face and asked if I wanted to come back and see her again sometime. I eagerly agreed and made plans to see her the following weekend. When I returned to the hotel, Leela was waiting for me with a bottle of champagne and a seductive smile. We spent the night together, and I couldn't help but feel like I was falling for her. Over the next few weeks, I became more and more enamored with Leela. I couldn't get enough of her and spent every spare moment I had with her. But as our relationship deepened, I started to notice strange things happening around me. My phone would constantly be ringing with unknown numbers, and I would often catch glimpses of someone following me in the shadows. I started to get paranoid and asked Leela if she knew anything about it. She brushed it off and told me that I was just being paranoid. But the more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that Leela was hiding something from me. One night, I decided to follow her when she left the hotel. I watched as she met up with a group of shady-looking men and handed over a large sum of cash. My heart sank as I realized that Leela was involved in some kind of illegal activity. I confronted her about it the next day, and she broke down, confessing that she was actually a member of a human trafficking ring. She begged for my forgiveness and told me that she had only gotten involved in the business to pay off a debt. I was horrified and couldn't believe that I had been so naive. I knew that I had to go to the authorities and report what I had seen. But before I could do anything, I was grabbed from behind and a cloth was pressed over my mouth. When I came to my senses, I was locked in a small room with no windows. All I could hear were the isolated sounds of people screaming and crying in the distance. I realized that I was being held captive by the same people that Leela was working for. I spent the next 3 days in complete darkness without any food or water, wondering if anyone would ever find me. I had almost given up hope when I heard the sounds of the doors opening. Then, to my delight, a group of police officers stormed into the room and rescued me from my terrible fate. I was reunited with my family and friends, but the experience had left me traumatized. I couldn't shake the memory of being locked in that dark room, not knowing if I would ever see the light of day again. As I recovered, I couldn't help but feel guilty for my involvement with Leela. I had allowed myself to be blinded by my attraction to her and hadn't noticed the warning signs. I vowed to never let something like this happen to me again and to always be more cautious in my choices. The experience taught me the importance of being aware of my surroundings and to never let my desires cloud my judgment. It was a harsh lesson, but one that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Story 2. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night that make you curl up in bed with a good book and a cup of tea. But I wasn't in bed. I was driving through the winding roads of a small town in the middle of nowhere, looking for the address of my next client. I was a high-priced escort, the kind of woman men paid top dollar for to fulfill their every desire. It was a dangerous job, but it paid well and allowed me the freedom to come and go as I pleased. As I pulled up to the address, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease wash over me. The house was a dilapidated old mansion, with peeling paint and broken windows. It was the kind of place that seemed to ooze with a sense of malevolence. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off my nerves as I made my way up to the front door. As I knocked, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The door swung open, and a man stood in the doorway, his face hidden in the shadows. He was tall and muscular, with a menacing presence that made me take a step back. "You're the escort," he growled, his voice rough and menacing. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, I'm here for the evening." The man didn't say another word. He just turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open for me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was a good idea, but I had a job to do and I couldn't back out now. I followed the man into the house, my heels clicking on the creaky old floorboards. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside, with cobwebs covering the walls and a thick layer of dust covering every surface. It was clear that no one had lived in this house for a long time. The man led me to a room at the back of the house, a small, dingy room with a single bed in the center. He gestured for me to sit down and I did, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't answer, he just stood there, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. I couldn't tell if he was even listening to me. I tried again. "Is there something specific you'd like me to do for you tonight?" Still no answer. The man just stood there, staring at me with a creepy smile on his face. I began to feel like I was in the presence of a predator, and I knew I needed to get out of there as fast as I could. I stood up and tried to make my way to the door, but the man was too fast. He grabbed me by the arm and dragged me back to the bed, his grip like iron. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his voice dripping with menace. I struggled and tried to break free, but it was no use. The man was too strong and he had me trapped. I was trapped in that dingy room with that disturbed man for what felt like an eternity, subjected to his every twisted desire. I tried to escape, but he was always one step ahead of me, always watching, always waiting. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the man let me go. He pushed me out of the house and into the night, a sick smile on his face as he watched me stumble away, my body battered and bruised. I made my way back to my car, shaking and sobbing as the rain pounded down on me. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I had always known that my job was dangerous, but I had never experienced anything like this before. I knew I had to go to the police, but I was terrified of what the man would do if he found out. I didn't want to end up like the other women who had gone missing in this town, never to be seen again. I drove home, my mind racing with thoughts of what I should do. When I finally arrived at my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, too exhausted and traumatized to move. I stayed there for days, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I couldn't just ignore what had happened, but I was too afraid to go to the authorities. Finally, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I gathered all the evidence I could find, the clothes I had been wearing that night, the man's business card, and I put it all into a package. I sent the package anonymously to the police, hoping that they would be able to catch the man who had done this to me. I never heard back from them, but I knew I had done the right thing. I never worked as an escort again, and I never forgot the things that happened to me that night. It was a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, and it made me grateful to be alive. Story 3. It was a calm autumn night in the small town of Millville, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. The only sound that could be heard was the howling wind and the pounding rain against the windows. It was the kind of night that made you want to curl up under a blanket and wait for morning to come. But I wasn't able to do that. I had a job to do. I was an escort, and tonight I had a client waiting for me at a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. I pulled up to the neon-lit building, the headlights of my car illuminating the dilapidated sign that read the Raccoon Motel. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the rain, my heels sinking into the muddy ground as I made my way to room number 12. I knocked on the door and waited, my heart racing in my chest. After a moment, the door opened and a man stood before me, his face shrouded in darkness. He didn't say a word, but simply gestured for me to come in. I hesitated for a moment, a sense of unease settling in my stomach, but I didn't have a choice. I needed the money, and this was the only way I knew how to get it. So I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The room was cramped and musty, the walls stained with years of neglect. There was a single bed pushed against one wall, and a small table with a lamp that cast a dim glow over the room. The man still hadn't spoken, and I couldn't see his face clearly in the shadows. But I could feel his eyes on me, taking in every inch of my body. I tried to push down the feeling of dread that was growing inside of me and forced a smile. "So, what can I do for you tonight?" The man finally spoke, his voice low and guttural. "I want you to do whatever I want." I swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I had been with plenty of clients before, but something about this man felt different. Dangerous, but I couldn't back out now. I had already accepted the money, and there was no way I was going to leave empty-handed. So I took a deep breath and tried to put on a brave face. "Okay, let's get started," I said, my voice shaking slightly. The man led me over to the bed and sat down, gesturing for me to join him. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually complied, sitting down beside him. That's when I noticed it. The smell. It was faint, but it was there. The smell of decay and rot. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the musty smell of the old motel room. But something inside of me knew that it was more than that. The man reached out and touched my face, his fingers cold and clammy. I shuddered at his touch, but didn't pull away. I couldn't let him know how terrified I was. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "Do you know what I am?" he whispered. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "I am a monster," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And you are my prey." I couldn't take it any longer. I scrambled off the bed and backed away, my eyes darting around the room as I searched for an escape. But the man was faster. He lunged at me, his hands grasping at my arms as he dragged me back towards the bed. I screamed and kicked, but it was no use. He was too strong. I was trapped, and I knew that I was about to become the next victim of this monster. But just as I thought all hope was lost, the door to the room burst open and a group of men in police uniforms stormed in, guns drawn. The man released me and turned to face the officers, snarling like an animal. But it was too late. They had him surrounded, and it wasn't long before he was subdued and taken into custody. I collapsed on the floor, tears streaming down my face as the reality of what had just happened hit me. I had almost become another victim. I later found that the man had been preying on young women like me for years, luring them to his secluded motels under the guise of being a client. But it was all a trap. He would overpower them and leave their bodies mutilated and unrecognizable. I was lucky to have escaped with my life, thanks to law enforcement officers who have received an anonymous tip. As I was being loaded into the ambulance to be taken to the hospital, I couldn't help but think about all of the other women who hadn't been as fortunate as me, the ones who had become nothing more than a name on a list of victims. I vowed to never let myself be put in that position again, and I made the difficult decision to leave the escort business behind. It was a risky and dangerous job, and I knew that I couldn't put myself in harm's way any longer. The memory of that night still haunts me, but I am grateful to be alive and able to tell my story. As for man, he was brought to justice and sentenced for all the crimes that he had been committing, but the fear he instilled in me will stay with me forever. Thank you for joining us on Spider Stories. We hope these escort horror stories will leave you with a newfound appreciation for the dangers lurking around us. Until next time, stay safe and beware.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to stay tuned for more true stories.